James and John approached Jesus. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to grant our request." "What is it?" Jesus asked. They replied, "See to it that we sit next to you, one at your right hand and one on your left, when you come into your glory." Jesus told them, "You do not know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup that I will drink? Or be baptized in the same baptism as I?" "Oh, yes, we can," they replied. Jesus said in response, "From the cup I drink, you will drink. The baptism I am immersed in, you will share. But as for sitting at my right or my left, that's not mine to give. It is for those to whom it has been reserved." Now the other 10, on hearing this, became indignant at James and John. But Jesus called them all together and said, "You know how among the Gentiles, those who seem to exercise authority are domineering and arrogant. Those great ones know how to make their importance felt. It cannot be like that with you. Anyone among you who aspires to greatness must serve the rest. Whoever wants to rank first among you must serve the needs of all. The promised one has come not to be served, but to serve, to give one life in ransom for many." And this is the good news of salvation. Well, as we just heard in the reading tonight, James and John were rather cheeky, I think, sitting at the left and at the right hand of God and at the parousia. But what does Jesus say when asked this question? He says that, "Can you drink the cup that I will drink? Can you be baptized as I have been baptized?" Meaning, can you suffer as I have suffered and will suffer? So this is the question for James and John and for us. If we want glory, if we want to sit on the left and the right of Jesus, we have to be prepared as Jesus was to suffer. The first reading from Isaiah also gives us this theme of the suffering servant, that life is to be offered, and it's offered to justify many people. Some mysterious way, this suffering is redemptive. So I was thinking about suffering. You know, you're probably like me, who likes to suffer? So I was thinking, what meaning, or how do I approach this suffering? So I immediately thought of one of my friends, Pope Francis. I'm thinking of someone else. Anyway, I'm thinking, what does Pope Francis say about suffering? So I went to the web to look up Pope Francis suffering, and I found one reference, and I'm sure there were others, but most of the times when Pope Francis speaks, it's about compassion and love and graciousness and giving oneself. He doesn't speak of suffering. So I had to think, how does he handle suffering? Well, you probably know that not only are we pen pals, but I've had a couple visits with him. And last year, when I was there with the people from New Ways Ministry, one thing I think that stood out to me of how he handles suffering is humor. If there is to be suffering in our lives, we have to have something to energize us, and I think he gets energy from humor. In fact, when we first went into the room and I saw him, and I said, Pope Francis, when I see you, I really see the face of Jesus. It's like looking at the face of God. And he just smiled and kind of laughed, and he says, "Oh, I don't think God's face looks that bad, does it?" He has a great sense of humor, and he said to all of us, he said, "Do you know the prayer of St. Thomas More on humor?" Well, I had never heard of it. I don't know if any of you have heard of the prayer of St. Thomas More on humor, but he got a copy of it for us, and we read it. And you can look it up on the web. It's very short, but it begins, "Lord, give me some good digestion, and give me something to digest." And then it goes on, but as I said, it's very short. But it's a humorous prayer, and he said, "I say this prayer every day." So I think one of the ways that he deals with suffering that comes into all of our lives is by humor. And that's something that I want to take to heart, and I share that with you. The other way that I believe Pope Francis deals with suffering is with hope. I think they're the two things that I have gotten from my visits with him. The suffering is endured by hope and by humor. So just last week, we had an audience with him, and I brought with me an intersex woman, a transgender man, a set of parents who have a transgender daughter, and a doctor who gives gender-affirming care. Because I've had a little correspondence with him about transgender issues, which I think the Vatican is all mixed up about that, but that's another issue. And he listened very intently. And when the transgender man spoke about the priest, when the transgender man, when he was a boy of 8, went to confession and told the priest that he wanted to wear boy clothes, and the priest was telling him, "No, if you do that, Jesus, and die tonight, Jesus won't recognize you in heaven." So, and things of that nature. And when Pope Francis heard this and the testimony of the parents who talked about their transgender daughter, who tried to commit suicide 3 times, he was very pained and clutched his cross. the hope came in, I believe, when he said to the people, to all of us there, that God loves you as you are. So don't pay attention to what priests in confession say if they are telling you that God is not pleased. God is pleased with you. And particularly when the transgender person, the transgender man, spoke about how his transformation to be the person that he is, how he looked upon that as like the baptism of Jesus, because at the baptism of Christ, we know the Father's words were, "You are my Son in whom I am well pleased." And that's what Michael said. This is what he thinks of and what he prays about. You are my Son in whom I am well pleased. And you could see that Pope Francis was pleased with that. He was smiling. And that gave us hope to see that Pope Francis is understanding. And I said to him, well, I think these people also have to talk to Cardinal Fernandez at the Dicastery for the Congregation of the Faith, because we know what came out from there last April. So we left with a great deal of hope, especially when he said, he knows that in the United States we have some bishops who are not very accepting, shall we say, of LGBT people, in particular trans people these days. And he said, one of the things I'm asking when I am looking to appoint new bishops is, what is their response? How do they feel? What is their position on transgender people? So we left with a great deal of hope for the future, at least of the leadership here in the US. So I guess I want to just share with you that suffering will come. It comes in all of our lives, but we must always cling to hope and humor. And I also want to, close with some parting words from the foundress of my first community, School Sisters of Notre Dame, which, if you know some of my story, I was a school sister of Notre Dame for 40 years, and then because of some altercation with the Vatican, I had to transfer to another community. So now I've been a sister of Loretto for over 20 years, so I have a lot of years behind me. But the foundress of my first community, the School Sisters of Notre Dame, who appointed me to this ministry and supported it until 1999 with the Vatican intervention. But the foundress wrote to the sisters in the United States, because she was in Germany, and the order was begun in the early 19th century. And she wrote to the sisters in the United States, and part of one of her letters I have repeated to myself over and over again when we think about suffering. So I'd like to share that quote with you and leave it as a quote of hope. But she said, "All the works of God proceed slowly and in pain, but their roots are the sturdier, and their flowering the lovelier." So when I think of suffering in my life, I think of Mother Teresa's words about there will be suffering in your life, but your roots become sturdier, and the flowers are much lovelier. Amen. Amen.
like to call Sister Jeannine to come up. She touched on some of the highlights of her story in her homily, but I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit more because there's a lot more to it. Sister Jeannine joined the School Sisters of Notre Dame in 1960, and she taught in junior and senior high schools for several years in Baltimore. She received an MA in math from the University of Notre Dame in 1969 and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1975. In 1971, she became involved in a pastoral outreach to the lesbian and gay community at the University of Pennsylvania at that time. Of course, that's what it was called in those days, lesbian and gay. The group grew into the Philadelphia chapter of Dignity. And while teaching mathematics at the College of Notre Dame in Maryland, she co-founded the Baltimore and Washington, D.C. chapters of Dignity. So we have the co-founders of 3 of our chapters. In 1977, along with Father Robert Nugent, Jeannine co-founded New Ways Ministry, a national Catholic social justice center working through education for the reconciliation of LGBTQ+ people and the Catholic Church. Many of you know of New Ways, of course. Jeannine has written and edited numerous articles and books, including 2 books concerning LGBTQ issues, Building Bridges and Voices of Hope. And those books became the subject of a Vatican investigation. She kind of skipped over that in her homily. But that's what got her into trouble. For approximately 20 years, when she was in the School Sisters of Notre Dame, she was assigned to LGBTQ ministry. But as a result of those writings and that investigation, in 1999, the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, then headed by Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict, permanently prohibited her from any pastoral work with lesbian or gay people. But that did not stop her, as she referred to in her gospel, or in her homily. In 2001, she transferred to the Sisters of Loretto, where she has continued her ministry of education and advocacy on behalf of LGBTQ people ever since. With the change in Vatican leadership on the election of Pope Francis in 2013, tensions with the institutional church began to change. And in 2015, Jeannine led a pilgrimage of 50 LGBTQ+ pilgrims to Rome, where the group was given VIP status at the Ash Wednesday papal audience. So, signs of progress. In 2021, Jeannine began a correspondence with Pope Francis, a personal correspondence with Pope Francis. At the end of that year, he sent her a handwritten letter in Spanish congratulating her on, quote, 50 years of closeness, compassion, and tenderness in a ministry that he described as being, quote, in the style of God. And Jeannine spoke about some of the meetings that she's and the New Ways Ministry staff have had with Pope Francis ever since. To those of us who've been around for a number of years, these are truly remarkable events. And they're a testament to the 50+ years of ministry with New Ways Ministry and your other ministry, Jeannine. And that personal relationship is a very important one at this point. Jeannine requested that meeting of the Pope with transgender persons. And that was probably the most extensive contact he's ever had with a range of transgender persons. We know he's met with some transgender people, but this was a group that, a 90-minute meeting that was of substance and with a doctor providing care and so forth. I was rather astonished myself to read of that. That just happened last week. Is that right, Jeannine? Yeah. So, Jeannine has received numerous national and international awards for her pioneering ministry and is the subject of a documentary film, In Good Conscience, Sister Jeannine Gramick's Journey of Faith. She's very interested in religious life, of course, having been in it for some 60 years. 60 plus. In promoting the recognition of women's ministries and in reform and renewal in the church in general. She has served on the national boards of numerous women's organizations and is strongly committed to a justice agenda. As I was corresponding with Jeannine about her being with us tonight, she shared some of her memories of her long connection with our chapter, Dignity New York. Our chapter began in 1972, the year after Jeannine started meeting with lesbian and gay students at the University of Pennsylvania. She took part in some of our early Christopher Street parades here in New York, marching up Fifth Avenue with some cheers and some boos as well. Yeah. Yeah. Were you in habit then as well? Were you in a veil? So it was clear that you were a religious sister. Yeah.
With John McNeil and
with John McNeil and
yeah.
Bernard Lynch as well. Yeah, yeah. Who are also winners of the Gormley Award, by the way. In 1982, and I see Andy Hum here, and I know Andy remembers well the hearings in the New York City Council for the so-called Gay Rights Bill, as it was then called, which was the first bill in this city to end discrimination in jobs, housing, and public accommodations. And because of that, Dignity New York gave Jeannine a certificate of appreciation. This is the language of that time, 1982, and for her unrelenting and extraordinary efforts in seeking to educate Catholic clergy and laity about homosexual sisters and brothers, and in doing so, continually to strive to remind the Church of its conscience, and for the courage the courage to be our friend when no one else would be. A few years later, Jeannine even ran for vice president of Dignity USA on a ticket with Michael Oliveri, who was then president of this chapter, though they did not win. So, in graciously accepting our invitation to accept our award tonight, Jeannine ended one of her emails in this way: "I love the chapter and all you have done for LGBTQ people and our church." Well, we can certainly say the same in return. And that is why it is my great honor and pleasure to present Sister Jeannine with Dignity New York's highest award for service to dignity and the LGBTQ+ community, the Gormley Spokes Award.
The gay rights bill that I testified, and I was talking with Andy about it before, and I have a little funny story about that, because while this ministry was kind of new and people didn't like it, I didn't get that many people knocking on my door, but my provincial did. Mm-hmm. And so my provincial, well, all of them. I went through about 4 or 5 of them.
You wore them out?
and they all supported me. 3 times the Vatican asked our Superior General, and I went through about 4 or 5 of those, to investigate me and to recommend sanctions. And each time the community said, yes, we have looked into what she's doing, we've talked to people who come to our workshops and so on. And she's doing the work of the church, and we recommend no sanctions. But, that wasn't what they wanted to hear, so they had to appoint their own commission. But my point was that my community, the School Sisters of Notre Dame, appointed me to the ministry and took a lot of flack because of it. And so anyway, back to the story of testifying in New York City Council. I got a call from my provincial right after that, and she said, Jeannine, somebody said they saw you on television for the bill, and you had your veil on. I said, yeah, I did. And she said, but you don't usually wear your veil. I said, no. And she said, but you were using the institution. I said, of course I was. Isn't that what an institution is for? To serve the people. So I say that story because I want people to know that the School Sisters of Notre Dame supported me 100%, but when it came to the Vatican in '99 saying that I should leave the ministry, they were very much grieved because they said if I didn't, they would have to dismiss me, and they, of course, didn't want to do that. I didn't want that. And so I did transfer to the Sisters of Loretto, and people have asked, well, what about, didn't the Vatican go after that? Well, yes. The Sisters of Loretto got 9 letters from the Vatican, and then they stopped, and I should say they answered them very judiciously, like, well, we'll talk with Sister, and then the next letter from the Vatican, well, try to persuade, and if she doesn't end the ministry, then maybe you should dismiss. Well, anyway, they answered them very, very well. But the letters stopped in 2009, before Pope Francis. And we don't know why, but my suspicion is, if any of you are following church history and nuns, in 2009, the Vatican announced that they were doing an investigation of all religious communities of sisters in the United States, because they were just too progressive. So my opinion is that, okay, they were going to investigate all the nuns. Why go after this one? We're going after all of them. Okay, so that was 2009, and the investigations went on. Each community had a visitation, and in 2013, they were settled because Pope Francis came. And he just said, I mean, he did. It was more elegant, but it was like case closed.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things I think. Well, one of the many things I'm grateful to Pope Francis.
When did you run into Cardinal Ratzinger on the plane? That was quite a story. By coincidence, yes?
Yeah. Has anyone heard that story before? Okay, I'll tell that story.
Yeah.
Well, in 1999, we got the Vatican, and my provincial was very worried. She said, oh, Jeannine, I think you're going to get excommunicated. And because Tisa Balasuriya, who's a theologian from Sri Lanka, had been excommunicated like the year before, and so that's what they were doing. So she said, we need to make a pilgrimage to Munich, where our foundress was buried, and pray for a miracle, because we need a miracle. So she and I were in Rome getting the plane to go to Munich, and who was there? She said that was Cardinal Ratzinger. I said, that's a look-alike. I mean, he had on a black shirt, no collar, no garb, just a black shirt. I said, that's a low-level, career person at the Vatican. So we get on the plane. That person is in the back, seat empty next to him, so I go over and sit down next to him. And I said, oh, are you a priest? Because he had on a black shirt. He said, yes, I'm a priest. I said, well, I'm a sister. I'm a school sister of Notre Dame. Do you know the school sisters of Notre Dame? Yes, he said. My aunt was a school sister. Well, then I knew it was Cardinal Ratzinger, because he had had an aunt in our community. She had since died, but I knew there was a Ratzinger in our community. So, so then I said, oh, are you, I said, well, what was her name? Ratzinger. I said, are you Cardinal Ratzinger? Yes. I said, well, I'm Sister Jeannine Gramick. and then he said, oh, I have known you for 20 years. Because they had a file.
Yes, I'm sure they did.
Well, actually, Bob Nugent had seen some of the file. Well, yeah, that's another story. Anyway, we talked about my being in this ministry, and I told him about Dominic, who I met in Philadelphia, and that's how I started ministry, and that we were having masses for lesbian and gay people. No, that's what we call it, lesbian and gay people. He thought that was wonderful. He said, but you teach, meaning that Bob Nugent and I were giving public workshops. In other words, you can do anything private, that's fine. But once it's public, that's a different story. So I said, yes, yes, we do. He said, and I said, we give workshops. And do the bishops come? I said, well, some do and some don't. I mean, if I were more accurate, I would have said, well, a couple do and most don't. But we did have bishops come to the workshop. In fact, Bob, I remember him saying one time, I think it was Bishop Matheson down in Texas, got up and was, talking, and Bob was saying, gosh, he's saying things I'd never say publicly. So this was, well, when I'm referring to Bishop Matheson, right after Vatican II, we had very progressive bishops. Not a lot, I mean, not overwhelmingly, but many of them went over to the council and came back fired with peace and justice. And that changed in the 80s with the appointment by John Paul. So, okay, so back to the Ratzinger story. And then he said, we talked about always our children. How many remember that document from the bishop's address to parents? And the bishop, it had gone through a number of versions, and the best one was the first one, because it had conscience in it, and then we left out conscience. But anyway, I said, well, the bishops have now published the final document. It was approved by the conference. And he said, oh, he was like very surprised. He said, but I do not yet have a copy. I said, oh, if I knew I was going to see you, I would have brought a copy, because I have a copy. So, I mean, we were bantering. He was really quite lovely, quite lovely. And I asked him if he had ever met any gay people. And well, I will comment on that too. And he said yes, when Pope John Paul and I were in Berlin, he said, there was a demonstration of homosexuals. That was his idea of meeting gay people in a confrontational situation. I know you're all going to say, oh, he was surrounded by gay people. However, this is what I have come to believe, that, and there are reasons for it, but in the mind of people like Cardinal Ratzinger or Pope Benedict, you're not gay unless you're sexually active. So there could be gay priests, but if they're not sexually active, then should people like Cardinal Ratzinger, they were not gay.
In his mind,
yeah.
yes.
So,
That's a fantastic story, Jeannine. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for everything.